I'm joined by Keith Land, who is the head of Canterbury Land for the Earthquake Commission. Welcome, Keith. Nice to have you here.
Yes, hi, Vanessa.
I do have to say it's a very appropriate name that you have for your division.
Thank you.
Perhaps it was predetermined that this is where you were going to end up, as dealing with the land issues in Canterbury?
Yeah, we've had a few of those lines over the last 3 or 4 months.
But, I bet you have.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm sure I won't be the last one to draw attention to that. There are some really complicated terms with the area that you look after. There are two in particular that I want to ask you about. So the first one, increased liquefaction vulnerability. Can you explain to me, we can guess what that means. What does it mean technically from your department? Okay,
so in the Canterbury Earthquake series, a number of properties suffered from changes in the land. And those changes have caused those properties to potentially be more vulnerable to liquefaction in a future event.
So this is also connected with the increased flooding vulnerability. The two are quite separate, as in one's surface flooding versus up from the ground?
So they're very similar in many regards. The changes to the land have caused for increased flooding vulnerability. Some properties which previously didn't flood are now likely to flood in a future event, and those that were flooding perhaps will be flooded more seriously in future events, as opposed to increased liquefaction vulnerability, where again in a future event some properties will be more vulnerable to liquefaction or more serious liquefaction.
How do you work that out? I mean, the flooding is a wee bit more obvious, and we can see that with the weather patterns that we've had, particularly over the last 2 years.
Yes.
However, liquefaction is a bit more, is it a guessing game? Is this where your geologists are stepping in? How does that work? Okay,
so I think what we should start by just briefly outlining is increased liquefaction vulnerability is pretty much new for Christchurch, certainly. It's something that hasn't really occurred to this extent anywhere else in the world, realistically. And so there's a lot of work has been done since the earthquakes. We've worked very closely with engineers, and our engineering firm we use is Tonkin and Taylor, who's worked with EQC for over 20 years now. They, along with other experts, have been helping us really get to understand some very new things, some complicated changes to land, and therefore there are some really rigorous processes which are being used to assess which properties are at risk of increased vulnerability either to liquefaction or flooding in future.
And actually, I mean, I know that you're dealing specifically with Canterbury here, but these lessons must be quite valuable across the whole of New Zealand. However, I'm guessing that probably Canterbury is the one with the liquefaction issues more than anywhere else.
Yes, the September 2010 earthquake was quite quickly named the Great Land Earthquake, which was nothing to do with me, of course. But that was then seen as possibly the most severe liquefaction that had been seen in New Zealand and perhaps in the world at that time. And then the event in February 11 completely eclipsed that.
Yeah.
So it's a massive challenge for Canterbury. And to your point, EQC will certainly be looking to take lessons out of what we've seen in Canterbury, both on land claims and other damage for future use.
Absolutely. Now, you talk about it being on a global scale, and I think that that's something that's, it feels very, very local for us, but of course this is a major global event we're talking about too. How have other countries handled kinds of land damage? I mean, you said that Canterbury's sort of worse than other places for liquefaction. But traditionally, how have other countries handled it?
So I think the key thing we should say is that land cover, as provided by EQC in New Zealand, is pretty much unique.
As opposed to like contents and actual house, you're talking about the land itself?
Yes. Okay. So the EQC arrangement in New Zealand does provide cover for damage to dwellings, damage for contents and damage for land, and it's the last portion which isn't really provided elsewhere in the world. So we don't really have too many examples of how other people have done this.
So other countries, if these kinds of issues occurred, would they therefore have no cover at all?
I can't speak for every country, but most countries do not provide cover for land damage.
Right, okay. So in some ways we are quite unique in that we are going through this process and getting recompensed for land. Okay, interesting. How do you work out which properties exactly? You know, I mean, you read a bit in the paper about sort of, well, the place on the right of me had liquefaction and I didn't, and how do you draw those lines?
Okay, so if we talk about increased liquefaction vulnerability, so with Tonkin and Taylor, we've assessed in excess of 140,000 properties in Christchurch, or Christchurch and Canterbury. And we've used a number of scientifically based models to start those assessments. Each of those properties has then been looked at, as I say, on an individual basis. And we then do, I would call it a sense check, which is to look at areas more generally and say, this house on the right appears to be vulnerable. Why is this one next door to it not vulnerable? Okay. And there are a whole host of reasons why models can produce some odd outcomes. So we're very confident that the second review at an area level will pick up those anomalies.
Okay. Just quickly, I want to touch on the declaratory judgment that's happening at the moment through the courts. From what I understand, this is affecting areas like Flockton Basin, and so that therefore falls into your increased flooding areas?
Okay, so the declaratory judgment was held 2 weeks ago, right. So we're now waiting on the outcomes from the court. The declaratory judgment was around EQC seeking clarification around increased flooding vulnerability and how we might treat the settlement of claims for increased flooding vulnerability. So we're awaiting those outcomes, hopefully by the end of the year, but more likely early next year.
Okay, and that's specifically flooding, not liquefaction?
So that started as increased flooding vulnerability. Other parties did bring increased liquefaction vulnerability into the hearing, so we will get some clarification on ILV as well. To your point about Flockton Basin, yeah, there are a number of properties in Flockton Basin which will be potentially ILV, and EQC is working through those properties in the same assessment process as the rest of Christchurch.
So that's liquefaction and flooding vulnerability?
Yes.
Yeah.
The key one being flooding.
Yeah, absolutely. These are really complex issues that we're learning a lot about as we're going through. Thanks for your time, Keith.
Thank you.
Now, stay with us, because when we come back, CanCERN's Marcus Irvine finds out about Jack and Pack and dealing with Type B and Type C foundations.